Welcome to WikiPodcast.
Hello.
Today, we're diving deep into a question that, well, it feels particularly relevant as we navigate the complexities of modern life. Is religion dying?
The big question, a
Yeah.
really big one.
It is, and we've gathered a fascinating collection of perspectives on secularization that is, how societies shift away from religious influence.
hmm
And our goal today is to really try and understand what these trends tell us about the place of faith in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's maybe start by unpacking this fundamental idea of secularization. What is it really?
Good place to start.
At its core, sociology defines it as the declining importance of religion in society and culture.
Okay.
Think of it as religion losing its sort of widespread authority and religious organizations having less social muscle, less power.
Right. But you mentioned it's complex, so it's not just a straightforward march towards everyone becoming an atheist then.
No, not at all. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. It's much more nuanced than that.
So, what are the different ways it shows up?
Well, it can mean that different parts of society, like, say, government or education, become separate from religious institutions. That's one way.
Differentiation, is that the term?
Exactly, differentiation.
Yeah.
Or it could mean that even within those non-religious areas, religion just doesn't play as big a role as it once did. Marginalization, perhaps.
Okay.
It might even shift so that faith becomes a much more personal, private matter. Less about public life, more internal.
Right. Less visible, maybe?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And for a long time, the dominant idea in social science was what they call the secularization thesis.
Yes, I've heard of that.
This suggested that as societies modernize, become more rational, and, science and technology advance.
Religion would just naturally become less significant, less needed.
That was the core idea. But here's where it gets really interesting, though. Recent research on a global scale has really started to question that simple prediction.
Okay, so the story of religion just fading away with progress isn't quite accurate. That narrative is being challenged.
Not at all. Or rather, it's much more complicated. When we look at the big picture globally, it's messy.
How so?
While many developed, industrialized countries have indeed seen a rise in secularity, the total number of people who identify with a religion worldwide is actually growing.
Growing. Really? How does that work?
It's largely because countries where religion is still very important tend to have higher birth rates. Demographics, essentially.
That's a fascinating point. So even if some parts of the world feel less religious, the overall global influence of religion isn't necessarily shrinking.
Exactly.
It's just shifting. Shifting in where it's concentrated, perhaps.
That's a great way to put it, and it definitely makes you wonder what that means for the future.
It does.
And what's even more intriguing is that the percentage of people who say they have no religion might actually be decreasing globally.
Wait, decreasing? Why?
Again, demographics.
Yeah.
Because countries with lower religious affiliation often have lower birth rates, below replacement levels sometimes.
Wow.
This led the sociologist Peter L. Berger to actually coin the term desecularization.
Desecularization. The opposite trend.
Kind of, yeah. Suggesting that religion is actually regaining prominence in many parts of the world, or at least holding its ground much more strongly than the old thesis predicted.
That's a powerful idea. It seems to go against what many people just assume is happening. Are there clear examples of this desecularization?
Absolutely. We're seeing secularization slow down or even reverse in certain areas. Think about the countries of the former Soviet Union after the fall of communism. Religion saw a resurgence there.
Right, after being suppressed.
Exactly. We also see it in many Western cities where there's been significant immigration of populations who are, generally speaking, more religious.
Okay, that makes sense.
And even Europe, which is often held up as the prime example of secularization, well, it shows a very mixed picture. It's almost becoming the exception rather than the rule globally.
So definitely not a universal one-way street.
Not at all.
And you also mentioned something interesting earlier, that even people who don't actively belong to a specific religion might still hold personal religious beliefs. Or practice sometimes.
Yes, that's a key finding in a lot of recent studies. It really blurs the lines between what we traditionally label religious and secular.
It suggests the categories themselves might be too simple.
Exactly. The idea of strict divide, a dichotomy between the two, is often misleading. They aren't always mutually exclusive. They interact in complex ways.
So thinking back to those early theorists, Marx, Freud, Weber, Durkheim, why did they think modernization would automatically lead to less religion?
Well, they had different angles, but a common thread was the idea that modernization, rationalization, science, these things would basically provide alternative explanations for the world.
Explanations that were previously in the domain of religion.
Precisely. Things like natural phenomena, human origins, even suffering. Science offered new frameworks. Some also argued that adapting deep spiritual needs to the rapid pace of scientific change was just difficult.
That makes a certain logical sense. But were there counter-arguments even back then or later on?
Oh, definitely. For instance, Christian Smith suggested, somewhat controversially, that intellectuals might have a kind of vested interest in promoting secularization because it enhances their own status.
Interesting perspective.
And he also noted that intellectuals are often inherently critical of their own native cultures, which in the West often meant Christianity.
Okay.
And then you have thinkers like Jack David Eller, who makes the really important point that secularization, in most of its forms, doesn't necessarily lead to atheism or the complete disappearance of belief.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. It's more about transformation.
Yes,
Yeah.
religion can simply adapt, change its role, maybe become more private, as we discussed.
Now, Eller also mentioned someone named Peter Glasner, who apparently identified 10 different versions or types of secularization. That sounds quite detailed.
It is quite detailed. Glasner really tried to break down this broad concept. We don't need to go through all 10, but maybe touch on a few key ones. Okay, so one we already mentioned is differentiation. That's where secular spheres like the state, the economy, science, they become distinct from religion, operate on their own logic.
Got it. Separate boxes almost?
Sort of. Another is disengagement, where religion becomes less involved in specific aspects of social life it might have once dominated. Think maybe education or social welfare in some places.
Okay.
Then there's privatization, which we've touched on, religion becoming more of a personal belief, less of a public force shaping laws or collective norms. And finally, there's decline, which is probably the most common understanding, just a straightforward reduction in the number of people identifying with a religion or participating in religious activities, like attending services.
So it's a much wider phenomenon than just, fewer people showing up to church on Sunday. It's about how religion interacts with the whole structure of society.
Exactly. It touches everything.
It's also really interesting to consider the historical context. You hinted before that secularism itself actually has roots within religious history.
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it's true. What's truly fascinating is that the concept of secular clergy, priests, working out in the world, not in monasteries, has existed within Christianity since the medieval period.
Really? Secular clergy?
Yes. So the relationship between secular and religious authorities wasn't always one of opposition. They often coexisted, interacted, sometimes clashed, sometimes cooperated.
That changes the picture.
It does. And surprisingly, some of the core principles that underpin modern secularism actually evolved from ideas developed over centuries by theologians and Christian thinkers. Ideas about separating certain spheres, for example.
That really challenges the common narrative of this constant battle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And historically, the word secularization also had other much more concrete meanings.
Like what?
Like the state seizing church property. Think of Henry VIII dissolving the monasteries in England, or similar events during the French Revolution or Bismarck's Kulturkampf in Germany. That was called secularization too.
Ah, so taking assets.
Yes. Or it could even mean allowing clergy to leave monastic orders or deconsecrating a church building to use it for something else.
So a term with a long and quite varied history.
Very much so.
Then, jumping forward quite a bit, the 1960s in the West often come up as this key period for accelerated secularization. What was going on then?
The 60s were just a time of immense social and cultural upheaval in many Western countries, weren't they?
Definitely.
You had increased economic prosperity for many, the rise of youth counterculture challenging everything, the sexual revolution, new ideas about individual freedom, questioning authority.
All hitting at once.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And these shifts naturally led to a questioning of traditional institutions, and that included religious ones.
And is there any link to economics? I think I read something suggesting secularization might precede economic growth.
Yes, there are some studies suggesting that. It's complex, correlation versus causation and all that. But some research indicates that a general increase in secularization has historically tended to come before periods of significant economic growth. It's a debated point, but interesting.
That is thought-provoking. And there's even a theory linking it to automation. How would that work?
Yeah, that's a more recent idea. The argument goes something like this. As technology, especially automation, provides more and more practical, secular solutions to problems.
Problems that people traditionally turn to religion for help with, like security, meaning maybe even dealing with mortality.
Exactly. As technology offers secular answers or comforts for those existential or practical challenges, the perceived need for religious institutions or explanations might further decrease for some people.
Fascinating. Okay, let's look at some specific regions. The United States has such a unique, often paradoxical relationship with religion and secularism.
It really does.
Yeah.
The U.S. saw a gradual shift away from what was, a dominant Protestant establishment in the late 19th century towards a more officially secular public sphere by the 1930s. This was driven partly by intellectual movements.
But religion remained very strong culturally.
Absolutely. But then more recently, say between 2008 and 2021, we've observed a really notable decline in the number of people identifying as Christian and a corresponding rise in the unaffiliated, or the knowns, as they're often called.
The knowns, right? Does that mean they're all atheists or agnostics?
Not necessarily, and this is crucial. Many, maybe even most, of these knowns still hold some form of religious or spiritual belief. They pray, they believe in God or a higher power.
They just don't belong to a particular church or denomination.
Exactly. So it often suggests a move away from organized religion, from institutions, rather than a complete abandonment of faith or belief itself.
So perhaps less about losing faith and more about finding different ways to express it, or maybe faith becoming more individualized.
That seems to be a big part of the story in the U.S., yes.
What about Britain? Similar trends.
Britain's major period of secularization arguably began a bit later, maybe more seriously in the 1960s. And interestingly, that followed a kind of post-war religious revival.
Huh.
But yes, since the 60s, similar trends to the U.S. in broad strokes. A decrease in Christian affiliation, particularly Church of England identification, and a significant increase in the number of people who say they have no religion. And again, many of those were raised Christian, but now identify as non-religious.
And in Spain,
Yeah.
with its incredibly strong Catholic history, that must be a different story again.
Spain is seeing quite rapid secularization in recent decades, actually. It's been quite dramatic.
Why so fast there?
Well, a significant factor seems to be the historical association of the Catholic Church with anti-democratic political forces, particularly during the Franco regime.
Ah, the political legacy.
Yes, it led to a strong anti-clerical sentiment in some segments of society after the transition to democracy. And this has gone along with sharp declines in religious identification, church attendance, and even things like religious weddings or baptisms.
Right. In Germany, I understand there was a difference between East and West.
A very stark difference historically. East Germany, under the communist regime, experienced much more rapid and state-enforced secularization. Religious institutions were actively suppressed.
So a very different path to West Germany.
Very different, where religion maintained a much larger public role. It really highlights how political systems can dramatically shape religious trends.
Okay, let's shift continents. What about Asia? India, for instance.
India deliberately established itself as a secular state after independence, trying to manage its immense religious diversity. Though the interplay of religion and politics there is, of course, incredibly complex and often contentious today. Well, Confucianism is sometimes viewed by scholars as more of a secular, ethical, or philosophical system than a religion in the Western sense. But beyond that, the Communist Party actively promoted secularization, often suppressing religious practice.
Was there an argument about the effects of that early secular push in China?
Yes, some have argued that this early secularizing tendency, going way back historically, maybe left China without the same kind of strong, religiously rooted moral and legal foundation seen in the West. But conversely, others argue it might have contributed to China achieving political unity and maybe a more egalitarian social structure earlier on. Different interpretations.
Okay. And finally, the Arab world. That must be incredibly diverse.
Hugely diverse. It's really hard to generalize. But we are seeing some signs of increasing secular attitudes in some countries. Polls in places like Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco have shown declining support for very strict religious law, fewer people identifying as religious.
Any idea what's driving that?
Possibly economic factors, exposure to global culture. It's debated, but, and this is a big but, other countries in the region show the opposite trend towards greater religiosity or conservatism. And even where secularization seems to be happening, there are often strong backlashes against it.
So a really complex, often contested picture across the Middle East and North Africa.
Absolutely. It underlines again that the path of secularization is definitely not linear or uniform across the globe. There are always counter-movements, diverse local factors, political struggles, all shaping how religion and society interact.
Which brings us back to those critiques of the original simple secularization theory.
Exactly. The assertion that religion has just become less important globally is really challenged by what's happening in places like South Korea with its huge churches, the resurgence in Russia we mentioned, even the persistence of high religious belief in the U.S. despite the rise of the knowns.
And this idea of interplay, maybe. Secularization and resacralization happening at the same time.
Yes, some sociologists talk about that, especially in Western societies,
Or
a kind of dynamic tension between secularizing trends and renewed or transformed religious expressions existing side by side.
And debates about whether the U.S., for example, ever truly secularized in the way Europe did.
Right, or whether its form of secularism was always different, allowing for a high degree of public religiosity alongside institutional separation. And there's also the criticism that the very concepts and definitions of secularization might be too Eurocentric, based on the specific history of Christianity and the European nation-state.
Do they apply neatly elsewhere?
That's the question. Maybe not always, or not without significant adaptation.
So, taking all of this in, back to our big question, is religion dying? It really seems the answer is far more nuanced than a simple yes or no.
I think that's absolutely right. It's definitely not a simple yes. The data, the analysis, it all suggests this really complex interplay of secularization, yes, but also desecularization and just the evolving nature of religious belief and affiliation in the modern world.
It's not static.
Not at all. And what's so fascinating here is just the variety of ways different societies are navigating this transition.
Yeah.
How historical factors, cultural context, even economic pressures play such a huge role.
It really makes you think, and it raises, I think, an important question for you, our listeners.
Sure.
What does it actually mean for faith to adapt and transform in the 21st century, given everything we've discussed? How does it find its place?
That's the crucial question going forward.
Thank you for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.